I think you're doing two things, and it might be helpful to you to think about the difference between the two things. So there's the debunking mission of the paper. So, and I think that I want to see what other people say in response to you, obviously, but I was very persuaded by the debunking of the three categories being projected back to a time when I think if you're right, if there's no other evidence, then that part of the paper, I think, is very well established. But there's a second part of the paper where you are advancing your own theory of the content of the concept represented by privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. So that part of the paper is not completely argued for, I think. And the paper's already long enough, so you're not going to be able to put in a lot more. But I think you want to think about the challenges to your affirmative account of the content of privileges or immunities of the United States. Because obviously there's a gigantic literature now on this. You can't deal with all of it, but at the very least, you can indicate, what the differences of opinion are, and then do a bracketing maneuver. So I also think you do need to say something about the legal history of the phrase privileges and immunities, privileges, or immunities, privileges, and rights, privileges, immunities or rights or advantages. There's a whole bunch of very closely related phraseology. Kurt Lash's work talks a lot about this part of the history, and so particularly important, I think, is Article 3 of the Louisiana Cession Act. Just having reread it prompted by your paper, I think that it's entirely consistent with your theory, but I do think you need to build that part in if you're going to make the claim, as you do on page 75 in the last paragraph that carries over, that you are providing the legal history of the term privileges and immunities of citizenship, because without at least some canvassing of the prior legal uses of that phrase in authoritative documents between Article 4 and 1868, you really haven't done the work that would validate the claim you're making at the end of the paper. A great paper. I really loved it. I learned a lot from it, and I think I am like 90% on my way to being convinced.
Michael?
Two, I hope, quick comments. One, a comment with a curable comment with suggestion, and the other, a conceptual difficulty that I don't really know how to think about. The first is the term, the trichotomy that you debunk is all over the debates. Both sides use it. Nobody disputes that that's the way to think about it. What they do dispute is what the content is. There's a little bit of dispute about all three, but especially social rights is a mess. And so they all use the term, but that doesn't mean that they all mean the same thing about it. My suggestion is, rather than just sort of say this isn't a thing, because it's obviously a thing. This is the way the people who are dealing with the 14th Amendment talk about the 14th Amendment. And however little you may see it in antebellum materials, I'm just completely unpersuaded that this was not, the way the people at the time of the 14th Amendment are thinking about it. My suggestion is that instead of just trying to say that it doesn't exist, What you need to do is to drill down more into what the category of social rights is. There are a number of answers to the question that will entirely support, I think, I mean, I'd have to think it through, but I suspect you'd find that many of those actually, are supportive of your final position. I just think it would be much more persuasive paper if you did it that way rather than to pretend that the trichotomy doesn't exist. Just a quick example of this, I mean, is the total, two-facedness of the segregationists on the question of social rights, because at the time of the 75 Act, when the Congress is going to outlaw segregation, they all say, oh no, it's a social right. You can't legislate with respect to social rights. Reconstruction ends. Now we have the state passing laws requiring segregation, and suddenly it's perfectly okay for the government to legislate with respect to social rights. They are just talking out of two sides of their mouth, and I think that is, there are other reasons too. So that's the suggestion. Here's my conceptual problem, which has nothing to do with social rights. It has to do with the public. You're embracing your answer to the public rights and then the political rights categories. You're on page 8. Page 9, 9 to 10. Here's your argument. You say, well, public rights are excluded from the category of privileges and immunities because, you say, a state could reserve such rights for its own citizens. Presumably, they own the oysters, they own they're providing the welfare benefits, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's fine, nothing wrong with that argument. And then you say, but when you move from Article 4 to the 14th Amendment, we're now talking about discrimination among the state's own citizens, and so you say that the reasons why those things are excluded from Article 4 are thus mooted. That's your phrase, are thus mooted. Okay, but exactly the same argument could be made with respect to political rights. The reason why people can't vote when they're sojourning in another state is that they're not citizens of that state. They have no right to vote there. And so it makes sense for Article 4 not to include the right to vote. But once we're talking about discrimination among the citizens of the state, those considerations are thus mooted. And so I think this argument cannot support your conclusion that public rights are now covered, but political rights are not covered.
And Chris.
So some of what Judge McConnell said is similar to what I'm going to say. I mean, just if you look at the 1872 stuff, if you just read through that, it's everywhere. And Sumner is as forceful about pure questions of society falling outside the 14th Amendment as anyone. So instead of saying this is debunking the trichotomy, I think really the key move is to say that the three categories aren't exclusive; they overlap, and that in the civic social, if you're talking about the imposition of social inequality by limiting someone's civil rights, by making them be in a particular part of the train, that inequality is covered. So you're looking for the term social rights. I think if you look for social equality, you'll find a lot more hits in these databases. And there's lots of people in 1866. At 13th Amendment, you find it, in the 1850s, like, oh, you Republicans, you want social equality. And they say, no. All we're saying, they sometimes don't even say civic equality, but three kinds of equality. And, the Democratic argument that, you're trying to impose social equality, well, it's not pure social equality, the Republican response. They say it is, preventing people from being insulted in the civic realm. In terms of Article 4, it seems like there is an analogy, a close analogy to the stuff about social equality. If you think about just pure insult of people from different states. So, people say, where are you from? And I say, well, I'm from Mississippi. And where are you from? So being a citizen of Illinois and coming to Mississippi, I can't say, I don't have any kind of entitlement under Article 4 that people be nice to me, they not insult me, because I'm a citizen of another state, even though as a citizen of one of the states, I have right to the privileges of citizens in the several states. The explanation would be, well, that's social equality from state to state. So that, it seems like, I don't know if there's any material, but that was a background assumption of the limits of Article 4. And that's what Sumner, and just everybody in 1872 is talking about at great length. Even at the time, they're trying to desegregate common carriers in the schools. So at the end of the day, I don't think I disagree with the outcomes, but just making it less iconoclastic would make it more plausible to a lot of people who just have been reading the history and spending more time in that history. It would just make it less jarring.
It wouldn't be an Elon Orman paper if the first draft were not iconoclastic and jarring, I think. But I wonder if I'm going to keep it that way for the following reason, and this responds to Michael's first point, which I think you're latching onto. I think everything you say about social equality is correct. But I think it's whether Congress is doing something that is seeking to enforce social equality or rather to remedy civic inequality is a merits question. And the work that I'm trying to do is, if you look at the literature, on this trichotomy, people believe, and by people I mean tons and tons of scholars, believe that there is a category, not on the merits, that is definitionally excluded from coverage, and that this category is called social rights, and it includes things like public education and marriage, or interracial marriage, or intermixing in public schools, or something like that. And the work that I am trying to do is say there is no such categorical definitional exclusion of this thing called social rights from the coverage of the Privileges or Immunities Clause. If you think it's enforcing social equality, I agree. The clause does not require social equality. It requires civic equality or civil equality. And it's a merits question whether a particular statute is seeking to enforce one or remedy the other. And I think there's a lot of work. I think the social rights category was weaponized by the court in Plessy. I think it was weaponized by proto-originalists who opposed Brown v. Board, and I think it's weaponized by modern anti-originalists who want to say that originalism does not justify Brown v. Board. I think that's why it's so entrenched, because no one has had incentive to dislodge this trichotomy for a long, long time, and which takes me, I think, also to Michael's point, which I actually don't see it. I see a lot of social equality, but I don't see a lot of talk of social rights, and when I see talk of social rights, it's consistent with social rights or civil rights, with the exception of the colloquy over whether marriage, and Moulton said, marriage is not covered. Don't worry, you Democrats. We're not going to require marriage to be intermixed with the races because it's a social right. And Thornton looks at him and is like, excuse me, what are you talking about? Are marriages contracted into in each state? Are contracts regulated in each state? If it's not a civil right, then what is it? And I don't see it. I don't see it in the literature. On the political rights point, I have an answer to it, and it comes by very quickly, and maybe I need to spend more time with it, and maybe it's not persuasive, but I don't think political rights are privileges and immunities of citizenship. I think they are privileges and immunities of a subclass of citizens known as electors. And maybe that's insane, maybe that's crazy, maybe the reason that's true translates to public privileges, but I don't think they were understood to be privileges of citizenship as such. And I think public privileges were understood to be privileges of citizenship, albeit state citizenship or municipal citizenship. But I don't develop that very well. It's like a sentence, right, in the paper. And maybe I do need to think more about that without making this 50,000 words, which to Larry's point, all I'll say is, yes, I agree. I'll just say two things. One is I have my, my 14th Amendment book, which sort of introduces a lot of the legal history and argument, but it's pretty short. And I just can promise a future paper where I go through all the evidence for sort of this fundamental rights reading of the Privileges or Immunities Clause that it refers to rights in the Constitution and so on. The paper is tentatively drafted, titled Reversing Incorporation, because it turns out if you look at everything Michael Kent Curtis cites and Akhil Amar cites, and I humbly submit Randy and Evan, it is supportive of the equality view of civil rights under state law. And that's forthcoming, but that's currently 120 pages long and growing, and so I don't know what I'm going to do with it exactly. But I can't add 120 pages to this one, I guess is the point.
I hate to be the two-paper guy, but it sounds from the comments like the tripartite trichotomy and the argument about public rights there might be enough there to dig down deeper. And I think the better argument on the trichotomy is not so much that it's just didn't exist in 18, but it's something that's being constructed in the debates themselves that later filters down into the doctrine, beginning with the state cases about segregation and miscegenation, and later goes up to the U.S. Supreme Court. So that could be an interesting story to tell about how that happened. A question I have about the second portion, the public rights portion, to the extent you are yoking kind of and people at the time were connecting the right to public education, for example, with the tax burden, I wonder if an expedient for a determinately segregationist or discriminatory state would just be to uncouple that tax burden. This is not wholly hypothetical. For a brief period in the 1860s, the federal government in Washington, D.C. had separate tax bases for the white schools and the all-black schools. So does that take it out of the category that you would regard as a privilege or immunity, and how would your theory kind of deal with that?
So I have a methodological concern, a scholarship concern, and a just what it is that we are doing here concern. I'll start with the scholarship concern. You are not the first scholar to challenge the category of social rights as being one that was largely developed and weaponized by enemies of Reconstruction to reclassify things that were generally regarded, or at least most Republicans regarded, as included within civil rights as social rights, and therefore marginalizing claims, particularly to access to public accommodations. The second, Jamie Foxx in particular, has done a lot of good work in this regard and also highlighted in ways that you don't because you're focused on legal meaning. The degree of Black American contestation of racist efforts to exclude public accommodation access from the category of civil rights, which leads to my methodological concern. As far as I can see here, in order to buy the persuasiveness of your case, we really do need to be committed to the idea that the Privileges or Immunities Clause, or Section 1 as a whole, was designed to encode the legal meaning of privileges or immunities circa 1868, drawing from antebellum sources, because otherwise there's just, as Mike McConnell points out, a ton of public discourse that is saturated with what you say is a trichotomy that is not evinced in antebellum sources. And I think it's demonstrably false that the legal meaning of privileges or immunities was circa the antebellum period was ratified into the 14th Amendment. I mean, Republicans held views about what the Comedy Clause meant, namely that by the 1850s, it wasn't a comedy clause, that were legally unorthodox. Comedy clause means protection for sojourning citizens from out of state, not interstate protection. And yet the Republican Party platform, the first Republican Party platform, refers precisely to discrimination against citizens of particular states, not out-of-staters. And finally, this larger question of what we're doing here, and I guess here I'm going to take a page from Eric Siegel. Like, You don't need to convince originalists that Brown v. Board and Loving v. Virginia was correct. We basically all, except for like a couple of people, including Earl Maltz, whose name has been invoked, think that it was. Everybody who is confirmed to the judicial bench is going to take that view on pain of not being confirmed at all. And so the question is, like, who exactly is your audience here? Non-originalist? John Harrison, yes, okay. Because I mean, you're definitely right that this is weaponized against originalists by non-originalists, but I just can't see any of them actually being convinced either for reasons that are just methodological and also political moral. So I do wonder who you're trying to convince.
And Lee Strang.
Yep. Thank you for your paper, Elon. So I have two comments. The first one, I'll put my property professor hat on. This may be an example that's orthogonal, maybe an example that supports your thesis, maybe an example that is in tension and you'd have to distinguish. And as I was thinking through 19th century law, in particular property law, is it the case that public nuisance would be an aspect of a public right? So as you were describing the aspects of what you thought were public rights in the 19th century, all or almost all of those aspects seem to apply to public nuisance. So it was a common entitlement of all the citizens in that community. It was something that was a matter of legislative largesse. So think of the 19th century statutes that abated the nuisance of alcohol production or alcohol sales. An individual is not entitled to enforce public nuisances. There are analogies to the state of nature, private nuisance. It was a creature of a particular state's law. So I don't know if in which of those three ways it fits or doesn't fit within your project. I wanted to offer that. Second, this piggybacks on Evan's last point. So your paper, in part, is a response to address the so-called problem of Brown for originalism, but it seems like it's just adding to another problem, and here's what I have in mind. So we've got originalism can't lead to Brown, Alexander Bickel. We've got originalism can lead to Brown, Michael McConnell. Now we've got originalism can lead to Brown, Elon Werman. Other people have other rationales based on other clauses, and the problem is, this was something that Eric has written about, that it seems like the goal is justify Brown, and we've got lots of claims about different ways in which that's done, and it seems like it's motivated reasoning. And then the second is that you have lots of plausible claims, which undermines the claim that of the determinacy of any particular claim for the original meaning of the Equal Protection Clause, privileges or immunities, or some other aspect. So I wonder if this is contributing to another or different problem for Brown for originalism.
Determinacy point one more time.
That you have all these different claims now, a proliferation of claims, equal protection, privileges or immunities, and different privileges or immunities versions of that same claim to say that Brown is actually the correct result under the 14th Amendment. And to the extent that people think that they're plausible, it supports the criticism that the original meaning is indeterminate, or at least the scholarly community has not arrived at the ability to identify the determinate way to reach that result.
So none of these responses will do justice to any of the comments I just received. And Lee, your point is well taken, and it's just, who can persuade more people, me or Randy Barnett? And the answer right now and for the foreseeable future is going to be Randy Barnett. But, I hope at some point I overtake it. I agree. It's a proliferation. And what can I say? When I write something and publish it, it's because I think it's correct. Depends on how strong I might say within the plausible meaning or whatever. But there's not, I can't make other people see the light, right? That's the thought. Evan, on the what are we doing here? Why is Brown right if this paper is wrong? Why is Brown right? I don't know. You can have all sorts of non-religious arguments. You can have, because, social meaning of equal protection. Well, equal protection doesn't mean equal civil laws. It has to be the privileges or immunities clause. I think you say Brown is right in your new book because equality in public privileges was understood to be a fundamental right, and the clause guarantees fundamental rights. I think that's wrong. I don't think public privileges were fundamental, not in the way that civil rights were. I don't think equality in public privileges was fundamental. That's why we needed the 14th Amendment in the first place, to make equality a fundamental right in all of these things. So what's left? And so why are we here? Because because I don't know the answer to the question that John posed to me 3 years ago, and I feel like I have to answer it to know the answer to this question. It's all I can say. On the Republican unorthodoxy, this is not this paper, and, I have this whole longer paper that I said that, but let me just say one thing since it's been asked, and I have a captive audience and a microphone. John Bingham, in 1866, opposed the Civil Rights Act because he thought there was no constitutional power to enact the Civil Rights Act. And he said, that same speech, said, we have an amendment that will allow us to enforce the Bill of Rights against the states, and that will give us the power to enact the Civil Rights Act of 1866. How do we get there if your reading is correct, if incorporation is correct? And you can answer afterwards. You don't get the microphone back, sorry. So the answer is because Bingham defined the Bill of Rights as including all 8 amendments and Article 4, Section 2. I think he thought any right in the Constitution was part of the Bill of Rights. And he had an unorthodox reading of Article 4, Section 2 that required each state to guarantee the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States in the several states, which in his view required every state to treat its own citizens equally. He was not saying that that the Article 4, if Congress had the power to enforce Article 4, it would nationalize rights. It was understood that his view and the Republican view, if it was unorthodox at all, was that all the states had to treat their own citizens equally, but they can still define civil rights. The civil rights legislation in all 50 states, not 50 states, 30-some states varied at the time, and it coexisted harmoniously with the proposition that they had to treat their citizens equally. So how do you get the Civil Rights Act of 1866? By enforcing the Bill of Rights against the states. Well, if the Bill of Rights includes Article 4, Section 2, and if Article 4, Section 2 requires a state to treat its own citizens equally with respect to civil rights under state law, that's how Bingham thought that by enforcing the Bill of Rights against the states, you would get the Civil Rights Act of 1866. There is no incorporation. It's just wrong. It's just wrong, and it's another gospel everybody believes, and that's why it's a 120-page paper and growing that, Mike, can I submit it tomorrow for next year? But I can't do all of that. I can't do all of that in this paper. Like, why can't I just say, take all of these things for granted, and then here's a subclaim? Like, why can't I do that, I guess is my question. And I think, Ryan, yes, 2 hours ago, I was given the same point that's like, I need this genealogy. Like, how did this trichotomy come about? And that would be its own sort of beast, right? And, okay, so can they just tax white people? I don't know. And if you have an answer for me, email it to me.
Thank you for the paper. I thought it was really insightful, really interesting. And John, thank you for your comment. I thought it was really helpful and insightful as well. To my mind, the question of why Brown is right, if it is a question of clear, enduring importance. And part of what I think makes this paper very important. So the claim that you make about public privileges is an important one. The question I have, in a way, I guess it's been asked and answered, and it's a pretty simple question, but in making this argument, you account for logic, you account for experience, you account for other legal provisions, you account for debates, and I guess the question I have is whether, as this paper is, not with regard to your other work, are you really making an argument about original public meaning, or are you making an argument that accounts for many other things in law, including original public meaning? Because as far as the Brown question goes, I think it's an important distinction.
Great paper, Alon. Two very minor points, I think. One, methodological. You say at the beginning of the paper, Michael McConnell takes a look at kind of what you characterize as legislative history of 14th Amendment and post-ratification history. And you say, well, really what I think is more valuable here is to look at the pre-ratification history and legal meaning, right? And I understand the potential value of that, but what it produces is a highly abstract analysis where it's kind of saying like, we have this bucket of rights. Was this bucket of rights protected by the 14th Amendment? Yes, because the reasons for it not to be are mooted in this context. And is public education in that bucket of rights? Yes, because for these logical reasons, it can't be in some other bucket of rights. So it's all very kind of logic games and abstract and away from what anyone at the time of the 14th Amendment actually said about public education and the 14th Amendment, which is much more the focus of Michael's article, right, on Brown. And that's completely, that's valuable and fine. But I think that at the beginning of the paper, it might be worth saying a little bit more about your methodology and why that is a sound way to approach this, and why you think it's a better way in some ways to approach it, because you do it in a fairly dismissive, like 2 sentences way, right? And I think more needs to be said about that, especially in light of the concerns that Michael was raising about what people in fact said at the time, right? The other point, which is related, is in your treatment of the 2, I think it was only 2 cases, right, antebellum, one on marriage, one on public education, that you used to kind of bolster your analysis. I think you want to hedge that section a lot more than you do, because at least in reading it, and maybe I'm misreading it, but in reading it, it seemed to me like you were trying to take advantage of those 2 cases as lending significant weight to your position. And I just don't think they do, both because it's only 2 cases, but also because you acknowledge, to your credit, that neither of those cases is quite explicit. They're kind of just like, it's the dog that didn't bark in both cases, right? And I think it would be more powerful to just acknowledge, look, I'm not saying like these 2 cases are somehow, vindicating my view. I'm just pointing out that what very little there is antebellum is consistent with the legal meaning that I'm tracing here, and that's a modest claim, but that's better than something that flat out contradicts your claim, right?
Thought it was a great paper. I was really convinced on the trichotomy portion of the analysis, but I was not convinced that special or particular privileges appertaining only to a particular state's citizens, that if it was not covered by the comity clause of the privileges and immunities clause, that it was somehow converted into a privilege or immunity of U.S. citizens or citizens of the United States. And you have to kind of tack on some language, privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States in a particular state, which seems like that's not what the privileges or immunities clause actually protects. And I'm wondering if a different way to possibly get there is, might there be a privilege or immunity not to be discriminated against with respect to state special privileges, but that those state special privileges are not converted into privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States?
That's a great question, Adam. I think I basically dispense with this whole thing, in a paragraph, 2 paragraphs, because no one talked about this until the debates over the Civil Rights Act of 1875, right? So we have to work with the legal materials that we have. What we do know is when it was first applied in 1872 to the debates over what would become the Civil Rights Act of 1875, the Republicans, all but one, thought that public privileges were included. We know that public privileges were included within the scope of the state equal privileges or immunities clauses. And there's a textual difference, right? John Bingham's ellipses reading, right? This was the Article 4 guarantees the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States in the several states. And when they changed the initial draft language of the 14th Amendment for empowering Congress to enforce the privileges or immunities of citizens in the several states, they could have changed it to giving Congress power to enforce, or no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States in the several states. And then I would be sunk. And then I think Brown was wrong, if that's true. But they didn't say that. They didn't say privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States in the several states. They said all privileges and immunities of U.S. citizens, and in the structure of the clause, I think it means all of the privileges of U.S. citizens that it is within the power of a state to abridge. And that would include all state civil rights, constitutional rights, state under state legislation, and public privileges under state law. I think it covers all of them as a textual matter. None of this is definitive. None of this is definitive, but we have nothing else. We have nothing else, and we have to make do with the material that we have, and I think it's the best reading of the limited materials using the textual differences and all of that. And so I think it's a great question, and it goes to the heart of this move, and I don't think there's much more I can say. And maybe, but if that's true, I'm not sure what else there is to say. So it's a great question. Yes, your questions I take are somewhat related. I don't know if this is the time to joke that, well, I don't know if this is an originalism paper, because I know it depends on, like all the papers, I'm not sure are originalism papers this year, but is originalism just original public meaning, or is it something else? And I think Mike Rappaport and I tend to agree, and John McGinnis, that this is originalism, because original law, originalism, original legal meaning, originalism is originalism. I happen to also think, and I think Mike Rappaport agrees with me on this, but maybe not entirely, so I don't know if he's on the queue. But I don't see a huge difference generally between OPM and original legal meaning, because it was understood by the public that there were many terms of art, in the Constitution. John Bingham was asked by someone, what does due process mean? We have no idea. And he said, the gentleman can consult all the court cases. It's been well established. Even Jacob Howard, even though he had a rather confusing and confused speech, said, what are the privileges and immunities of citizenship? Well, he resorted to court cases and things like that. What I will say is I think that the original legal meaning, by going to antebellum sources before parachuting into the congressional record and the legislative debates, right, that at least, I think you can reasonably clearly establish this legal meaning. And then if you go into the debate, it turns out that this original public meaning is consistent with it. And so I think that the antebellum legal meaning actually clarifies what everyone was saying. So like a lot of the discussion, that McConnell and others have said as this category of social rights, I actually think they're talking about public privileges, not social rights. And that's the language that Trumbull, I think, uses. And so I think it actually clarifies the original public meaning. But Joel, I grant I don't say enough about it. It's already 33,000 words.
You've already said you're not going to be able to answer this question, so I'll just tell you that you need to answer it later, which is the taxation theory. I think much more needs to be said about it. It's probably going to be its own paper, and so after you write your 120-page paper, I think we need to know more about the taxation theory or the coverage of public privileges, because if it's taxation that's really doing the work, and equal taxation appears in Corfield as one of the many things back then, it's a lot of reason to think it is doing the work. It's going to be both overbroad and underbroad compared to our intuitions. This is not just a theory of Brown, right? It's essentially going to be under-inclusive because you can rebate the taxes. You can say, look, anybody we deny the right to attend the common schools, you can get your taxes back, we solve the problem. Or you can have different tax bases, things like that, if that's what's really doing the work. But it also might imply coverage of a lot more things. Like it might imply that Richard Epstein's sort of broad-based attack on all forms of redistributive government has more to it than originalists may have thought. If there is a sort of general principle that you have a right to get out what you put in or something, we're going to need to know a lot more about, and how does that work, and what are the principles of equality, and what does that mean? But that could be a really big deal. So I think you're probably right here, but if this is really doing the work, there's a whole other level of the dungeon that you've exposed, and at some point you're going to have to go in.
Mike Rappaport.
So, Elon, so first, I really liked the paper. I was really happy to see that the tripartite distinction was not in the earlier law. I had once looked to try to find it because all these scholars said it was there, and I was not able to find anything. So I think it's great that you sort of nailed that down. And for people like me who really focus in on the the evidence pre the enactment as opposed to afterward, that I think it's a really significant result. I wonder, so the main argument that you make for why the public rights are covered under the 14th Amendment, but not the comity clause, is that, well, that there was this problem about, people coming from one state to another and then getting the benefits, and that they would want to exclude that. And if that's what's doing the work, then I wonder whether you need to say more, or we need to think more about what those types of privileges look like within a state. So, if the poor laws are at the local level, so if you're in New York State and, you're at New York City, but then you go to Buffalo, and there's different, people in Buffalo might not want to pay for the, they might think of themselves as separate jurisdictions. The same might be said if you had local taxation and for schooling. So if what's sort of doing the work is that, well, this doesn't really make sense between different states, I wonder whether you might say the same thing. This doesn't really work at the state level because these are locally provided, and we don't want to do this for the same reason we don't want to allow New Hampshire and Massachusetts to someone going from New Hampshire to Massachusetts.
And Eric.
So, this comment actually applies to the room. 6 months ago, I decided to try to figure out what the Privileges or Immunities Clause actually means. So I went to read Kurt Lash, I went to read Randy and Evan, and I went to read Alon. 4 brilliant, smart, thoughtful legal scholars who also do history, and they all disagree unbelievably about what the Privileges or Immunities Clause means. What I said in my review of Randy and Evan's book is, what's a non-originalist to do with that? But more importantly, what's a judge to do with that? So I'm a judge acting in good faith, and I'm an originalist judge even, maybe. And I'm trying to figure out what the Privileges or Immunities Clause means, and I have 4 amazing scholars saying completely different things. I suggest to the room this is something you all better think about, because the more originalism fragments, and Alon is doing a great job of fragmenting originalism, which is not his goal, but he's doing it. The more you guys do this, the harder it's going to be for you guys and women. So that's my point. Yeah. Well, there you go, and there's 2 more. There you go. All those books were really good, and I don't know how to pick among them.
But my book has more truth per word, so I don't know if that counts for something. No, I'm giving you a hard time, Evan. We can bring out the fisticuffs at lunch. We're out of time already, over time, so let me just say, all thought-provoking. I'll think more about the local issue, especially because of the poor laws you could also remove from within a legal settlement, right? It was one legal settlement to another. So within a state, you could do that too. And I actually haven't thought about whether that has implications for other types of public privileges, so that's very interesting. And if anybody has thoughts on the taxation and redistribution issue, please send them to me, because this is the Achilles heel of the paper. It's become clear today, and so please just help me figure that out. And if we can't figure it out, then then it's wrong. So,
Thanks, Alon. Thanks, John. And thanks, everybody.